The German army mocked its opponents and paid the price. The summer of 1916 became a turning point in the history of the First World War, marked by the beginning of one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the 20th century, the Battle of the Somme. This campaign was the result of a complex interplay of military and political factors that, by the middle of the war, shaped the actions of the Entente and the Triple Alliance. By mid-1916, the front line in the West remained virtually static. After the initial maneuvers of 1914 and the race to the sea, the front stabilized from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Trench warfare, characterized by a system of deeply echeloned trenches, barbed wire, and massed use of artillery, led to a protracted crisis of offensive operations. At the beginning of 1916, the German command launched an offensive at Verdun, seeking to exhaust the French army. The Verdun meat grinder went on from February and resulted in enormous losses on both sides. In these conditions, the Allies, above all Great Britain and France, were forced to find a way to divert German forces from Verdun and strike at another sector of the front. It was on this basis that the plan for a large-scale offensive along the Somme took shape. Initially, it was assumed the offensive would be a joint Anglo-French operation. France was to play the leading role, but due to colossal losses at Verdun, the main burden fell on the British Expeditionary Force. By this time, His Majesty's army had grown significantly thanks to the mass recruitment of volunteers in 1914-1915. The summer of 1916 became the moment when the new recruits, the so-called Kitchener's Army, were to test themselves for the first time in a large-scale battle. For several months, the Allies prepared artillery positions, brought up reserves, and stockpiled ammunition. The main tactical idea was to use an extremely powerful artillery barrage to destroy German fortifications, after which the infantry would be able to occupy the cleared positions with relative ease. British propaganda assured soldiers that after weeks of shelling the enemy would be practically annihilated. The offensive began on July 1, 1916 and immediately entered history as a day of horror. Despite an artillery bombardment unprecedented in scale, German fortifications on the heights and in the depth of the defense remained largely intact. German soldiers, hiding in deep concrete shelters, survived the barrage and, when British infantry went over the top, met it with dense machine gun and mortar fire. The result was catastrophic losses. On the first day alone, the British suffered about 60,000 killed, wounded, and missing, more than 19,000 of them irrecoverable. It became the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. The summer of 1916 became a symbol of the cruelty and seeming senselessness of positional warfare. The Battle of the Somme continued until November and claimed the lives of more than 1 million people on both sides. Despite partial territorial gains by the Allies, a strategic breakthrough was not achieved. Nevertheless, the battle played an important role in wearing down the German army and in the development of new tactical approaches, including the use of tanks, first deployed by the British in September 1916. For ordinary soldiers on both sides, the summer of 1916 was associated with inhuman suffering. Endless artillery duels, mud, the stench of decomposing bodies, the constant threat of sudden shelling or gas attack made life in the trenches a true ordeal. And precisely in such conditions, episodes of bitter irony or even black humor sometimes arose. Soldiers could mock the enemy to show they were unafraid, but such actions almost always ended tragically, as the slightest carelessness at the front instantly turned into losses. The summer of 1916 found British and German troops locked in deep positional warfare. Both fronts consisted of a complex network of trenches, zigzag communication trenches, and numerous fortifications stretching for dozens of kilometers along the line of contact. The Germans, preparing for defense since 1914, had created a system considered one of the strongest in the history of the military art. The front line was protected by several belts of barbed wire, fortified machine gun nests, and concrete dugouts capable of withstanding even massed artillery fire. The British, less experienced in engineering terms, built their trenches hastily and often less meticulously, but by the summer of 1916 their defenses had also acquired a stable character. Life in the trenches was determined not only by military necessity but also by daily privations. Soldiers on both sides literally lived in the earth, wet trench walls slumped in the rain, mud and runoff water collected at the bottom, where scraps of food rotted and the remains of bodies from failed attacks lay. Stench, damp, and rats accompanied the soldiers constantly, creating the sense of a closed world from which there was no exit. The trenches were crowded with men, and every day they had to fight not only the enemy but also fatigue, disease, and moral exhaustion. Soldiers saw the enemy every day, if at a distance. Sometimes German and British trenches were only a few hundred meters apart, so that voices could be heard from the other side. At night soldiers went on patrols, crawling across no man's land to reconnoiter enemy positions or cut its wire. In the daytime they spent almost all their time under cover. The slightest raising of one's head above the parapet could end with a sniper's bullet. The silence was deceptive, everyone knew that shelling could break out at any moment. Despite the constant tension, a distinct culture of trench existence arose. Soldiers joked, composed songs, and traded stories about the enemy. The British pictured the Germans as iron men, disciplined and cold, yet capable of strange flashes of humor. The Germans considered the British stubborn and clumsy. Sometimes both sides exchanged shouts or taunts, especially in those hours when the guns fell silent and no attacks were underway. For the soldiers, such moments became a kind of relief. In a war where death lurked in every shell hole, laughter seemed a challenge to fate. The positions on the Somme in the summer of 1916 were especially tense. After the first weeks of the offensive, it became clear that the Allies were failing to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The British and French seized individual sectors of ground, but each step forward cost thousands of lives. The Germans stubbornly held every height, and their trenches became a symbol of resistance. In response to the attacks, the enemy not only defended itself but also mocked the Allies' failures. At times Germans climbed onto the parapet, waved their arms, or mimed British soldiers in ridiculous poses. They laughed loudly and demonstratively, convinced that their fortifications were impregnable and the enemy powerless to change the situation. It was in such an atmosphere that the episode later described by eyewitnesses occurred. During a lull, a group of German soldiers decided to stage a mock performance right in front of the British trenches. Their position seemed unassailable, the artillery bombardment had not brought the expected result, and so they felt themselves masters of the situation. For them, laughter became a weapon as powerful as bullets. It underscored superiority and was meant to humiliate the enemy sitting across the trenches. But it was precisely this overconfidence that led to tragedy. In the trench-bound logic of the Somme, where every movement above the parapet could cost a life, the appearance of a mock parade looked like a challenge not only to the enemy but to common sense itself. Feeling secure in the strength of their defenses and encouraged by the repeated failure of British attacks in preceding days, the Germans allowed themselves an act that under other circumstances would have seemed unthinkable. At midday, when the guns were quiet and the front was sunk in a tense lull, several figures appeared from one of the German trenches. At first the British soldiers, watching the enemy through periscopes and narrow firing slits, thought it was reconnaissance or preparation for a raid. But very soon it became clear, there was no real threat. The Germans were not moving in battle order but were deliberately forming up as on a drill square. Some held sticks that from afar resembled rifles, others waved tin cans, pretending they were hand grenades. The soldiers shouted taunts toward the British trenches, parodying officers' commands in close-order drill. The spectacle was overtly derisive. One German, pretending to be wounded, limped with exaggerated movements and laughed so loudly he could be heard even through the wind that swept the front. Another, stretching himself into a caricatured position of attention, stamped out a parade step as if mocking British military discipline. A third climbed onto the parapet and, waving his cap, shouted toward the enemy, "Well then, Englishmen, where is your artillery? Where is your offensive?" For the British opposite, this was an insult and at the same time a challenge. After weeks of preparation and promises from the command that the enemy would be destroyed by massed fire, they saw the opposite. The Germans had not only survived but felt confident enough to put on shows in the middle of a battlefield. Some British soldiers, despite their resentment, could not suppress a smirk. The sight was indeed absurd. But among the officers it provoked indignation. The enemy was breaking the unspoken rules of the front, where even in pauses a certain seriousness was preserved. The parade lasted several minutes. The Germans marched, tossed their tin cans, built improvised trophies out of them, and then sat on the parapet as if in a theater, demonstrating complete contempt for danger. Their laughter and shouting rolled across no man's land, and British observers wrote in field diaries of unacceptable, yet astonishingly brazen behavior. At precisely these moments a decision was ripening on the British side. The soldiers watching the German parade understood that such a demonstration could not go unanswered. Their silent anger gradually turned into the desire to punish the enemy. German laughter, which seemed to them a manifestation of impunity, sounded like an insult to all those who had lost friends and comrades in the senseless attacks of recent weeks. Each jeer, each comic movement only strengthened the resolve to wipe the smiles from the enemy's faces. This episode illustrated how war turned even humor and mockery into weapons. For the German soldiers themselves, this performance was probably a way to let off steam, an attempt for a moment to escape the constant tension and fear. But at the front, where every emotion was sharpened to the limit, such a gesture inevitably ended in tragic consequences. When the first minutes of the mock parade had already drawn the attention of the British observers, the Germans did not stop at drill and silly antics. Gradually their actions turned into outright mockery of the enemy sitting across no man's land. More figures climbed out of the trench, and now an entire group of soldiers turned the front line into a kind of stage. Loud shouts, derisive songs, and overt insults directed at the British filled the air. With ostentatious self-assurance, the Germans shouted that the English army is incapable of even leaving its trenches. One, pretending to be a brave attacker, demonstratively climbed onto the parapet, waved a stick, and, as if charging the trenches, fell theatrically to the ground with an exaggerated groan. His comrades around him laughed so loudly that echoes rolled along the front. Another soldier with a piece of tin in his hand imitated throwing a grenade and, laughing, mimed the explosion as he dropped to the ground. For the German onlookers within their trenches, this was a show cheerful and ridiculous, capable of distracting them for a moment from the horror of war. For the British soldiers watching the scene, however, such behavior was a challenge and a mockery of their sacrifices. With each passing minute, the taunts became more brazen. The Germans sang reworked versions of English army songs, inserting offensive words. Some shouted in English phrases like "Where is your artillery then?" or "Come over if you dare." Their English was rough, with a strong accent, but the words were clear. They sounded like a spit in the face. Among the British, such scenes evoked mixed feelings. Some soldiers, dulled by constant tension and senseless slaughter, treated it with bitter irony. The enemy's laughter, however offensive, looked absurd against the background of the general horror of war. But for most, such mockery was an intolerable insult. Soldiers who had lost friends in attacks where every step forward was paid for with dozens of lives saw in German laughter not just a joke but a sneer at the memory of the dead. Officers perceived what was happening differently. They saw in the enemy's actions a sign of overconfidence and an excessive sense of impunity. Each such gesture was a demonstration of superiority, an attempt at psychological pressure. In official reports, such episodes were characterized as enemy propaganda in living form, aimed at undermining the opponent's morale. Meanwhile, the German soldiers continued the show. One mimed a British officer, pacing back and forth, waving his hand as if giving orders, then immediately tripping and falling, eliciting another roar of laughter. Others assembled an improvised tank out of crates and rolled it along the trench, parodying the British attempts to use armored vehicles. The entire scene became ever bolder and overtly derisive. But within this overconfidence lay a fatal mistake. The Germans forgot that the enemy was not defenseless and not without means of retaliation. Their laughter and shouts were heard not only by frontline soldiers but also by observers who were relaying everything that was happening to the artillery. Every movement, every figure appearing above the parapet was recorded, and gradually precise coordinates were plotted on the map. Thus the Germans' mockery became not merely an expression of trench humor but a pretext for a retaliatory strike. They laughed and believed they would have the last laugh. But war does not tolerate carelessness. Where men saw only a momentary diversion, the enemy was already preparing the weapon of retribution. The laughter that rang across no man's land in the summer of 1916 was not merely a frontline joke or a fleeting display of audacity. In total war, where each day brought new casualties, the enemy's laughter was perceived as a weapon no less dangerous than bullets or grenades. For the Germans who staged the parade and theatrical performance, it was a way to demonstrate confidence in their own strength, to show the British their helplessness, and to underscore the futility of recent attacks. The laughter rang loudly, booming across fields where only yesterday bodies had lain, and for that very reason took on a sinister tone. For the participants, it was an act of psychological release. Weeks and months in the trenches broke men's minds. Soldiers lived in constant fear, watching comrades die from a stray shell or a sniper's bullet. In these conditions, laughter became a kind of defense, a way to forget war for a moment. Turned into a public performance and directed at the enemy, however, it became mockery. The Germans were not just laughing, they were laughing at the British, at their failures, at their losses. And that was what made the scene so painful for the other side. British soldiers who heard the enemy's laughter experienced complex emotions. Some, blunted by constant fear and loss, looked on almost indifferently. In their eyes, the Germans only made fools of themselves. But for many others, this laughter sounded like a personal insult. In a few days of the offensive, they had lost tens of thousands of comrades, and now, before the fresh graves had cooled, the enemy allowed himself to make merry. The British did not perceive German laughter as bravery or madness, but as humiliation, a sneer at the memory of the fallen. Officers observing the situation understood that the enemy's taunts were a deliberate display of moral superiority. The Germans wanted to show that British attacks were pointless, that no artillery preparation could break their defense. Laughter served as proof of their confidence. If the enemy laughs in the infantry's face, he does not consider it a serious threat. That was the main psychological effect. But laughter in war is double-edged. For those who laugh, it seems a victory, a display of strength and contempt for danger. For those who listen, it becomes a cry of mockery, stoking anger and a thirst for retribution. Thus the same sound had opposite meanings on either side of the front. In the German trenches, it was a sign of comradeship, trench brotherhood, and self-confidence. In the British trenches, it became a symbol of the enemy's arrogance and inhumanity. A ringing laughter hung over no man's land, but there was no real joy in it. It was laughter born against a backdrop of blood and fear, a laughter with which soldiers tried to wall themselves off from grim reality. And at the same time, it sounded like a challenge, a blow to the enemy's nerves. That is why British soldiers remembered it for a long time. Their diaries and letters home preserved lines about how the Germans mocked us as if the war were a game. Laughter and mockery on the Somme in 1916 became a kind of symbol of psychological warfare. It reminded men that the war was waged not only with artillery and bayonets but also with words, gestures, even emotions. Sometimes a single jeering word or gesture caused pain no less than a wound. But at the front, where every emotion was sharpened to the utmost, such laughter could not remain unanswered. And it was precisely then, when the Germans laughed the loudest, when the taunts rang out over Allied positions, that their confidence and carelessness turned into tragedy. Laughter, which seemed a symbol of superiority, was soon drowned out by the thunder of guns. When the German parade and its accompanying taunts reached their apogee, the British side was no longer merely watching from the trenches. At the front were special observers, soldiers and junior officers whose duty was to record any enemy movement, mark the location of firing points, and, if necessary, relay data to the artillery for gun laying. Armed with field binoculars and periscopes, they worked almost continuously, relieving one another every few hours, and it was they who first witnessed the Germans' brazen caper. In wartime, the role of observers is hard to overestimate. Artillery was the principal weapon of the First World War, and its effectiveness depended on the accuracy of its data. Every shell hole, every dugout, every machine gun post was plotted on the map. Observers had to determine enemy coordinates and notice even the slightest signs of activity, smoke from a fire, movement of figures, a muzzle flash. Their eyes were the eyes of the artillery, and thousands of soldiers' lives depended on their vigilance. Therefore, when the Germans began their show, the British observers took it not only as an insult but as a rare opportunity. German soldiers, usually concealed behind parapets and concrete shelters, had now themselves risen above the trenches. Their figures stood out clearly against no man's land. For an experienced observer, that meant a target had appeared. And although at first the scene looked absurd, marching with tins and sticks, mocking shouts, for those sitting in observation posts, it was nothing other than the enemy's mistake. Reports of German activity were quickly passed along the chain. The observer fixed the coordinates, made notes on his map, and then sent the report by telephone line or runner to the artillery officers. British positions on the Somme were saturated with communications, and the command paid special attention to this. Despite constant breaks in the cables caused by shelling, contact with the batteries was maintained regularly. For the gunners, such information was particularly valuable. Usually they fired at pre-registered coordinates, relying on reconnaissance and aerial photography. But now the target was live, observed in real time. Laughing and clowning, the Germans had in effect revealed their positions in numbers. In the diaries of British officers a remark would later appear: they showed themselves so openly that it was hard to resist the urge to punish them. It is notable that the observers themselves, despite strict military discipline, felt intense emotions. They saw the enemy laughing and hurling insults and understood at the same time that they held the key to retribution. Every German gesture was recorded coolly, almost mechanically, but behind these actions stood not only a desire to carry out orders but also to answer the humiliation. Transmission of coordinates proceeded quickly. Observers fixed the point by reference landmarks: a tree, a ruined farm, a line of barbed wire. Then the data were refined and the artillery battery received a ready mission. The German laughter, which seemed unstoppable, was already turning into a sentence. One can say that the observers became the invisible arbiters of the scene. Their work required cold calculation, but inside they remained the same soldiers as all the others. They had seen comrades die, knew the price of failed attacks, and now, when the enemy himself provided the opportunity to strike, no one intended to let it pass. Thus the observers' role in this episode was decisive. Without them, the German laughter would have remained only a bitter memory recorded in diaries. Thanks to their vigilance, discipline, and precision, that laughter was soon drowned out by British artillery fire. The irony lay in the fact that at the very moment when the Germans felt most free and unpunished, they were under the most exacting scrutiny. Gun laying in the conditions of the First World War was a process that demanded maximum accuracy, discipline, and carefully calibrated coordination among units. By 1916, the British Army had gained great experience in organizing massed barrages. Precise strikes on identified targets were rarer, as artillery too often fired blind, relying on pre-drawn maps and approximate reconnaissance. That is why the episode with the German parade was special for the gunners. The enemy had exposed himself, and the opportunity had to be exploited to the utmost. Having received the data from the forward observers, the battery officers began the standard procedure. First, the target's coordinates were checked against maps and known landmarks. Observers indicated that the enemy's activity was occurring in a specific trench visible from British positions. The gunners refined distance and bearing using the grid overprinted on the maps. If necessary, the data were corrected through repeated observation. Everything proceeded quickly but without fuss. Each step was prescribed by instructions and honed by countless drills. The officers determined which guns would be used for the strike. In most cases, medium artillery was employed: 18-pounders and 4.5-inch howitzers. They had sufficient range and accuracy to cover the chosen stretch of trench. The decision also depended on ammunition. Both shrapnel and high-explosive rounds were available. Against concentrations of exposed infantry in an open trench, shrapnel rounds with time fuses were considered the most suitable, creating a dense, lethal cloud. After selecting guns and shells, the calculations began. The gunners determined elevation, corrections for wind, humidity, and even temperature, all factors that could affect accuracy. For experienced layers, such computations were routine, but they required concentration and care. An error of even a few degrees could throw around tens of meters off target, allowing the enemy to escape. In the British frontline trenches, a tense expectation reigned. The soldiers knew the enemy had mocked them, and now each awaited retribution. Officers ordered silence and gave no sign that a strike was being prepared. The Germans continued their performance, laughing and shouting insults, unaware that every passing minute was being mapped by British gunners. Commands on the battery were issued with clipped precision: load, lay. The gun crews, smeared with soot and earth, worked quickly and smoothly. They placed shells, set fuses, and fixed the barrels in the required position. For them this was standard drill, but each understood that this time the target was special. It was not just a segment of trench, it was those very men who had just laughed at their army. Gun laying ended with a final check of the coordinates. The senior officer compared the observers' data with the mapwork and confirmed the order to open fire. At that moment, communication with the front line was established. The observers were to watch the results of the salvo and correct if necessary. This lay adjust system allowed high accuracy even if the first salvo did not fall perfectly. Thus, preparation for the strike was a chain of actions in which each link was vital. The observer sitting with binoculars in the trench, the artillery officer doing the math, and the soldier hefting a heavy shell to the gun all were parts of one system. The Germans who had laughed only minutes before were now merely a point on the map and a target for the salvo. And when all was ready, the battery froze awaiting the commander's last word. The heartbeat of every soldier matched the silence along the line. Then the short order cut the air, fire. When the battery commander uttered the brief, decisive order, the air seemed to stop. Seconds later the British trenches filled with a rumble that made the ground tremble. The gun barrels, already laid on the coordinates, jolted, and plumes of smoke shot into the gray sky. The din tore the silence as if the earth itself were shouting, throwing back waves of sound. For the gunners this was a familiar noise, but for the German soldiers exposed in their trenches during their parade, it sounded like a sudden sentence. The first shells fell on the very spot where a moment before laughter had rung out. The explosions heaved up columns of earth, planks, and human bodies. Shrapnel with time fuses burst in the air, forming a deadly cloud of metal fragments that showered down on German heads. Laughter and jeers instantly fell silent, giving way to cries of horror and pain. Where figures with tins and sticks had just been marching, there was now a bloody mash of mud, flesh, and shattered gear. The artillery worked in series. After the first bursts, the British observers refined the coordinates and relayed corrections. The second salvo was even more accurate. Shells were bursting directly over the trench, turning it into a grave for those who had not reached cover. Realizing the danger, the Germans rushed for the dugouts, but many did not make it. Those on the parapet or in the open were swept away by the blasts. Even the concrete shelters the German army prided itself on did not always hold. A direct hit from a high-explosive shell could collapse the roof and bury soldiers alive. For the British soldiers at the front, this was the spectacle of retribution. They heard the thunder of their guns and saw clouds of smoke and earth rise over the German trench. The very figures who had recently mocked and capered now writhed in the chaos of fire. One eyewitness later wrote in his diary, "The laughter stopped the moment our guns spoke." Their merriment did not last long. By wartime standards, the bombardment was brief, only a few minutes, but it was enough to transform the situation on that sector. The place where taunts had rung out became a void. Where trenches had been, gaping craters now yawned, filled with blood and mud. The German parade ended in a tragedy that survivors would remember as a lesson: the front does not forgive carelessness. The gunners silently checked results. Observers reported that movement in the German trench had ceased. Laughter had been replaced by silence. Here and there figures could be seen trying to crawl out of the wreckage, but most remained under the debris. For the British this became a symbolic act of revenge. The enemy who had mocked their losses now knew what it meant to be defenseless under a blow. From a strictly military point of view, this episode was only one of many local bombardments on the Somme. But the psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who had witnessed the German mockery felt moral satisfaction. They had proved that the enemy was not omnipotent, and that his laughter was only a mask that could be torn off with an artillery salvo. For the German units it was a bitter reminder that even in moments of relative calm one could not allow oneself to be careless. The roar of guns, the groans of the wounded, and the billowing smoke wiped the smiles from faces that only moments earlier had looked so confident. War again revealed its cruel logic: where men seek relief in laughter, it instantly returns them to the reality of iron and fire. The bombardment that crashed down on the German positions lasted only a few minutes, yet it was long enough for the parade, begun in laughter and mockery, to end in catastrophe. Where soldiers had just been marching with tins and playing out parodic scenes, mangled bodies now lay mixed with earth and broken trenchworks. For those at the epicenter there was almost no chance of survival. Shells burst directly overhead, showering everything with thousands of lethal fragments. The view after the shelling was horrific. Deep craters filled with mud and blood, smashed parapets, bodies heaped in the ruins, all bore witness to the power of British artillery. The few who survived looked lost and crazed. They tried to dig their comrades out of the wreckage, but in most cases found only mutilated remains. The laughter that had sounded so loud and self-confident a few minutes earlier vanished from this place forever. It was replaced by groans, screams, and the stillness of death. For the British soldiers watching, this became a kind of act of retribution. They saw the figures who had mocked them disappear. One officer later wrote home, "Those who laughed at our losses have now become losses themselves." Their merriment turned to dust. The soldiers felt satisfaction not so much from killing the enemy as from the fact that the humiliation they had endured from the taunts was washed away by artillery fire. For the Germans, the episode became a tragic lesson. The surviving participants in the parade never again allowed themselves such carelessness. They understood that even in a lull, when it seems the enemy is weakened and incapable of striking, danger can come suddenly. Laughter that had seemed a challenge to fate became their own sentence. Veterans would later recall, "After that day no one climbed onto the parapet for fun. We learned the price of such games." The tragic finale of this episode also became part of the larger picture of the Somme. For both sides it symbolized the pitilessness of the front, where even human humor and the desire to forget for a moment could end in death. In positional warfare there was no room for weakness or audacity, any mistake was punished instantly. And if for the British the shelling was moral compensation for the failures of the early days of the offensive, for the Germans it was a painful reminder that even strong defenses do not make a soldier invulnerable. Militarily, the losses from this bombardment did not change the overall situation at the front. The Battle of the Somme continued, the lines remained almost unchanged, and both sides continued to take heavy casualties in daily attacks and counterattacks. But the psychological effect was immense. Stories spread through the British Army about how the Germans had paid for their brazen behavior. These stories lifted spirits, proving the enemy was vulnerable and mortal despite his confidence. For the Germans, the tragic finale served as a warning that entered trench lore. Soldiers no longer allowed themselves open mockery of the enemy. Even humor and songs were now performed more quietly, within the trenches, not above no man's land where every sound could be heard and answered with artillery. The memory of how a few minutes of laughter ended in the deaths of dozens of men was too vivid and painful. Thus the tragic end of the German parade was not merely a local episode but a symbol of war itself. The First World War showed there was no place for frivolity. Every gesture, every word, every laugh could turn into catastrophe. And on the Somme in the summer of 1916 this truth revealed itself with particular force. Enemy laughter was drowned out by the guns, and with it died those who had considered themselves untouchable. The story of the so-called mock parade on the Somme in the summer of 1916 is not only of local significance but possesses symbolic value, allowing a deeper understanding of the nature of positional warfare and human behavior under total conflict. Its outcome can be considered from several perspectives: military, psychological, moral, and cultural. First of all, the episode clearly demonstrated the merciless logic of the First World War. In a front composed of a continuous line of trenches, every carelessness, every display of complacency or overconfidence could cost dozens of lives. The German soldiers who left their cover and mocked the enemy broke an unspoken rule of survival: never reveal your vulnerability to the enemy. Their laughter and jeers were perceived by the British as a challenge, and the appearance of a living target became a rare and therefore valuable opportunity for the artillery. Thus the laughter that was to symbolize superiority became a sentence. Psychologically, the episode shows the dual nature of laughter in war. For the participants in the parade it was an attempt at release, a way to escape the horror and tension of trench life for a moment. Soldiers living under the constant threat of sudden death needed an outlet for emotion, and at that moment laughter seemed an act of resistance to the war itself. Directed at the enemy, however, it turned into mockery, into an instrument of psychological warfare that could not go unanswered. For the British, German laughter sounded like an insult to the memory of fallen comrades and a sneer at their own suffering. The artillery's response was perceived not only as a military measure but as an act of moral retribution. The moral dimension of this story lies in how clearly it shows that war leaves no place for lightness and carelessness. Any attempt to turn the front into a stage for jokes and laughter inevitably collides with the harsh reality of shellfire and death. War suppresses the human desire for joy and makes it dangerous. Laughter, which in peacetime unites people and gives them strength, can become a cause of death at the front. For the British, the outcome of the parade was important in sustaining morale. Soldiers who saw the enemy laugh at them and then die under the guns took it as just retribution. Amid heavy losses, when every attack brought thousands of casualties, such episodes became psychological compensation. The enemy also suffers, is also vulnerable, and his arrogance can be punished. For the Germans, it was a lesson in discipline. In total war, even minutes of frivolity could lead to catastrophe. Those who survived understood that the front was no place for open displays. Henceforth, laughter and songs in German trenches were heard, but quietly and underground, not above no man's land, where every sound could be heard by the enemy and answered with an artillery strike. More broadly, the story of the mock parade reflects the essence of the First World War as an industrial conflict in which personal emotions, gestures, and actions collided instantly with an impersonal machine of mass destruction. Where once laughter might have been merely a sign of human weakness or daring, it now became a target for artillery. This war erased the boundary between individual actions and collective consequences. The mistake of one unit led to the deaths of dozens, and frivolous laughter turned into tragedy. Ultimately, the conclusion is clear: war does not forgive. It mercilessly destroys any manifestation of carelessness, turning even humor and mockery into a pretext for death. The laughter of German soldiers on the Somme in 1916 became a symbol of this harsh truth. It lasted only briefly, a few minutes, and was forever drowned out by the roar of British guns. In the memory of eyewitnesses, it remained as an example that at the front every gesture has a price, almost always paid in lives. Thus, the parade and its tragic finale can be seen as a concentrated reflection of the entire First World War, pitiless, mechanized, where men's fates were determined not by their courage or audacity but by the firepower of artillery and iron discipline. In this context, the story of laughter drowned out by explosions is not just an anecdote of trench life but a symbol of the nature of war itself, in which joy always gives way to death.